Welcome to Executive Insights. My guest today is Paul Bellack, Vice President of Global IT and Digital Transformation with Magna International. In this episode, we discuss Magna's digital transformation journey since 2015. Paul shares candidly his vision, strategies, key success factors, and lessons learned. It's a conversation packed with crunchy goodness that you won't want to miss. Good morning, Paul. It's an honor to have you join me today. Welcome to Executive Insights.
Delighted to join you.
Paul, when you joined in 2015 to lead global IT, you crafted a mission statement for creating security, scale, and synergy across the entire Magna enterprise without disrupting the decentralized business model. At the outset, this may seem to be counterintuitive to the conventional thinking of an enterprise CIO, yet it made perfect sense for Magna. Can you explain how did you arrive at this decision early on?
Sure. So decentralization is one of the defining characteristics of Magna. Each of our plants, and we've got about 350 of them around the world, are considered autonomous business units. And this decentralization is the single most important factor that lets us grow widely and quickly and has certain cultural and entrepreneurial implications. But one of the unintended consequences of the decentralized operating model impacts IT. And decentralization in IT is left unchecked over several decades. You end up with what I call sort of an everything architecture. There are no technology standards because there's no central governance to establish and manage those standards. And so this everything architecture eventually results in three quite profound business concerns. Number one, you can't secure the enterprise because there's no standards around which to base your security. Number two, you can't get economies of scale in IT operations and IT procurement because without standards, there is no scale. And third, you can't get the synergies that would be crucial to us as we grow and globalize and so forth. So the irony in all of this is that the easiest way to fix all of those from an IT perspective is to centralize, right? Security, scale, and synergy is really, grows out of centralization, but of course that would compromise our model. So the only way an IT transformation was going to be feasible and scalable at Magna was to pledge that we wouldn't disrupt the decentralization model, and that proviso is central to our mission statement. We're not going to compromise the decentralized operating model. But it meant that we had to be very thoughtful about our change management activities to ensure that we were adding value and not trying to disrupt the company.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And for the first few years, your transformation journey is focused on the IT transformation by creating a centralized service capability. And, I have to imagine that the change management piece must have been, so important. How did you manage to convince people and gain support for doing things differently and embracing the standardized capability? What lessons have you learned in this early days of the transformation journey?
Well, you're right. Change management was a huge challenge, and it was also a key component of ultimate success. To convince everybody and kind of gain support, we used two arguments that we feathered into all our communications. The first argument was basically an intellectual appeal. Initially, the IT capabilities that we're talking about, we're planning to address what I call commodity capabilities, desktop support, email, hosting, that sort of jazz. And we argued that as commodities, they don't impact production, they don't interfere with competitive advantage. So arguably, how could commodity capabilities possibly compromise decentralization? So that was argument number one. Argument number two was about using practical examples with an obvious business case and an obvious solution. And the best example of that was cybersecurity. So back then, when we started 5 or 6 years ago, cyber was emerging as a very sort of sensational topic, lots of high-profile hacks and data breaches all over the place. So we started educating senior management that without standards, crucial for our transformation, without those standards, we couldn't protect the place from a cyber point of view, and that's kind of an argument impossible to say no to. In terms of lessons learned, I think that the key lesson was that sort of classic change management techniques actually work. For example, we were very thoughtful on identifying what I call the cohorts for change. So there was a group of people who clearly supported us. There was another group of people who clearly didn't support us and weren't really at all that anxious to do anything that we were proposing. And there was a third group, of course, who were kind of sitting on the fence waiting to see what we were going to do. So having different communication strategies for each of those cohorts was kind of important in terms of our approach. Another lesson learned was constant, simple, consistent communication about what we were trying to do and why we were trying to do it. So in the early days, I had this one slide that was kind of color coded that laid out sort of the various streams of our activity. I must have used that slide 500 times, and everybody kind of was making fun of me and so forth. But after a while, everybody knew exactly what we were trying to do and why we were trying to do it. So just constantly repeating the message, I guess, is my point. Other lessons, quick wins, get a high profile accomplishment done, or in our case, it was email, and use it as a real example of how this could work going forward. Also, if you make a mistake, and we certainly made more than a few, admit the mistake freely and just move forward being smarter than you were before.
Yeah, that's such a thoughtful approach and very valuable lessons learned. And now that you've earned the trust and mind share, the next stage of your transformation journey is to focus on business transformation. What does this mandate entail?
Well, our strategy from the beginning was split into two phases. The first phase was our so-called utility platform that we just kind of talked about. So take the commodity capabilities, build them out to get kind of a secure, standard, cost-effective IT shared service. The second phase, to your question, was a business transformation to be started only after the first phase was more or less completed, because it's kind of was to try and do any business transformation without the foundational IT capabilities in place. So then the challenge was, what does business transformation actually mean in the Magna context, right? So we did quite a bit of thinking about that. And it turned out that a usable theme for our business transformation was, we call it common process, common data for our back office capabilities. And by back office, I mean HR, procurement, finance, that sort of thing. And if you think about it, those are, in our company, commodity business capabilities, not unlike email in a way. They don't offer real competitive advantage. It's just inefficient to have 15 ways to onboard an employee and 12 ways to do an accounts payable transaction. There should be one best way to do that. And so standardizing that kind of activity is not really compromising the decentralized operating model. Right? So that was the notion of business transformation. So we launched this common process, common data theme, starting with small but visible examples. The first one we did was actually centralized capital planning. So we had this spreadsheet nightmare underlying the planning and approvals of something like $2 billion of annual capital spend across the company. So it was clearly inefficient. So we found a simple way technologically to kind of standardize that. It went pretty well and proved our argument, and we went forth from there. And after a few smaller profile projects like that, we pulled out the big guns. We managed to get a global HRIS system powered by Workday for 160,000 employees approved. And if you think about something like Workday, that's the embodiment of standard data shared by all. And that, in fact, is a $50 million 5-year effort that we're about halfway through and seem to be doing well. And there are other similar high-profile business transformation initiatives that we're pursuing, but they're all about common data, common process. And I suppose one could argue that if you look at Workday, for example, it's not truly transformational from a technology perspective. It's a big SaaS solution. But I think in our case, the transformation is cultural and strategic because it proves that a common process, common data approach can indeed thrive in a company that remains very decentralized.
Yeah, and having to deal with such scale and complexity, how do you mentioned Workday as an example, but I have to imagine that you have to rely heavily on the vendor community. So how do you leverage vendors for innovation, both from a factory floor as well as business process perspectives?
Well, as you can imagine, we're a big global high profile company, so we naturally experience lots and lots and lots of interest from the global vendor community. So we try to be very thoughtful about levering that interest, and we do that in a variety of ways. First, we spread the work around. We have no single supplier for any major service. We do that to maximize our procurement leverage, to give us some resiliency in case one supplier has an operational problem, and to increase our learnings about best practices and that sort of thing, because we get more than what we could get from any single supplier. Second, we try to be proactively inclusive with our key vendors. We share our plans openly, at least annually, with all of our key suppliers. We engage our key suppliers in quarterly strategic reviews where not only we share our plans, but we get insights into their plans and their roadmaps. And third, when we get our entire IT organization together in our annual conferences, we invite key suppliers to those conferences, not only to attend, but we give them an opportunity to pitch their services to the whole IT Magna community in front of all the other suppliers, right? And in that setting, it's up to them to put their best foot forward in terms of sharing their innovations and so forth. So we're really quite thoughtful and proactive about engaging the vendors because they obviously have a lot to gain, but a lot to give as well. Factory floor is a little different because we have so many different and diverse stakeholders of the individual plants. There are many opportunities for various vendors to add value in so many different circumstances. It's still early days on factory floor innovation. So now we're focusing on kind of the art of the possible from any supplier that we think has something interesting to say. And at some point, we'll pick a few and bring the kind of leverage that I just spoke of earlier in the other domain.
And one of the measures for a successful digital transformation that's often talked about is enhanced customer experience. Now, when we think about customer experience, and oftentimes we refer externally, but in your case, the customers for your organization are your back office stakeholders, your line of businesses, as well as the 350 independent IT shops across your entire Magna entities. And that is an interesting insight that I learned from you from our last conversation. So I wanted to double click on the 350 IT shops and your services model. What would make a IT shop or the 350 IT shops choose your services versus an external vendor? What would be your marker for success?
Well, that's a really great question. It's an interesting topic that we talk about a lot. So essentially, as I've tried to explain here, we've established a centralized shared service in the middle of a decentralized company. The important distinction is that only about 20% of the things that we do are actually mandatory. The plants have to use this, which means that 80% are discretionary. The plants are free to choose us or a third-party competitor to meet their needs, and some do. So that clearly influences the way that we think about ourselves. So the answer is that, if we're talking about what makes individual plants choose us, the key driver is, of course, cost. The general managers of the plants who own their own P&L and manage that P&L very aggressively are always looking to save money. And so obviously we have to be cheaper than a third-party or alternative. But because our operation is scaled and tailored to unique Magna circumstances, we're almost always the cheapest choice. But we're tested every day in that regard because we routinely have to compete with these third party competitors. And if we aren't the cheapest choice and we find somebody who can do it better or cheaper than us, then we will and have outsourced a particular service to that provider. Our job is to deliver security, scale, and synergy, not necessarily through us. So our model accommodates outsourcing to a third party quite routinely. And just like a third party, we benchmark our services to other third parties. We do pretty well on that measure. We quote SLAs. We quote, obviously, a price. We're now beginning to formally measure customer satisfaction, just like a third-party supplier would. And I suppose, to close the topic, the ultimate measure of success in all of this is market share. So we routinely measure our internal market shares of all these discretionary services. They're typically in the 90s. There's always going to be 10% of our internal customers out there who, for whatever reason, don't use us. But we can certainly have a very well-scaled, efficient operation at 90% market share. And the good news is that over the course of time, the market shares keep going up, so we must be doing something right.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul, as an industry CIO for most of your career, and someone who also has a strong management consulting background, I'm wondering if you could provide some advice to your peers as we continue to journey through this post-pandemic phase.
Well, that's an interesting question too. If I think about my 40 plus years in IT, there's kind of a dichotomy that comes to mind. Certainly, lots and lots of things have changed. I mean, technology, obviously, users who are now so much more IT savvy and self-sufficient than they used to be. Vendors have proliferated. There's new business models now that were inconceivable even 5 or 10 years ago. Even the role of the CIO, the CIOs are much more sort of business process, more connect the dots type people than sort of the IT centric CIO of the past. So obviously lots of things have changed, but I think the dichotomy is that the basic notions of IT management haven't changed in 40 years. They're still essential, right? So there's still a requirement to figure out what an IT organization needs to provide our customers. There's still a need to figure out how to plan that delivery in terms of architecture and parsing projects and so forth. There's still a need to buy or build solutions and run them. Now, granted, the delivery mechanisms have changed for all of that, but the essence really hasn't changed. And the other thing that hasn't changed is the importance of team, of people and talent. I happen to be blessed with just a really great global team. We've been together for this whole journey, 5 or 6 years, and we've got a great mix of skill and style, and we just click. But team, talent, people, that never as well. In terms of post-pandemic thought, I think the pandemic has two things from where I sit. Number one, it's taught us that the speed of transformation could be much faster than many assumed, right? Lots of companies have really gone through a very rapid transformation in various domains. And I think that ratchets up, number one, management expectation, and number two, the absolute need for agility. Got to be able to turn on a dime these days. And finally, I think the respect for IT has gone up. In some industries, IT saved the day in terms of ability to work from home kind of without skipping a beat. I think we were pretty happy with the way we scaled up very quickly. And that enabled some of those speedy transformations that many companies went through. And I think it just further served to solidify the the essential role of IT.
Those are some great observations and advice, Paul. I really appreciate it. I think in my career, I've experienced, oftentimes many leaders, new leaders come into an organization and wanting to make these sort of transformational changes right away without recognizing what's working first. So I think your ability to recognize that and to know what to preserve and what to improve is really the key to your success. And the fact that you've been at the company and in such a senior leadership role for so long, that speaks volume. So congratulations to all your achievements so far, Paul, and all the best for the future.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation.
You've been watching another episode of Executive Insights by the IT Media Group. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, please check out other content on our YouTube channel, including CIO roundtable conversations and executive interviews. And don't forget to subscribe.